Hello everyone, my name is Helios. I'm the leader of this group. This is our final video presentation for economics, and here are my teammates, Queen and Cecilia. The first part will be by
Hi, my name is Ranfang Chong, and my student ID number is EE3203024. And today's presentation focuses on quantitative easing, or QE. By comparing the experiences of the United States and Japan, we examine why QE emerged, how these policies evolved over time, and whether they successfully stimulated economic growth or inflation. Through this comparison, we also analyze the macroeconomic mechanisms behind QE and evaluate its effectiveness under different economic conditions. To understand why QE emerged, we first need to understand the limitations of conventional monetary policy. Under economic conditions, central banks stimulate the economy by lowering short-term interest rates, lower borrowing costs, encourage firms to invest, and households to consume more, increasing aggregate demand. However, during severe economic downturns, interest rates can approach what economists call the zero lower bound. At this point, further interest rate cuts become increasingly ineffective, firms may still hesitate to invest, and consumers may remain pessimistic despite lower borrowing costs. As a result, traditional monetary transmission mechanisms weaken substantially. This created the need for unconventional monetary policies such as quantitative easing, where central banks directly inject liquidity into financial markets through the large-scale asset purchases. So although both countries adopted QE, the underlying economic environments were fundamentally different. For the United States, QE emerged mainly because of acute crisis. During the 2008 global financial crisis, financial institutions collapsed, credit markets froze, and aggregate demand contracted sharply. A similar problem reappeared during the COVID-19 pandemic when economic activity suddenly stopped. Japan's situation was very different. After the collapse of its assets bubble in the early 1990s, Japan entered a prolonged period often called the lost decades. Economic growth slowed, deflation persisted, and weak domestic demand became deeply embedded. Therefore, while U.S. QE was initially designed as emergency stabilization policy, Japan increasingly used QE as a long-term strategy against structural stagnation. QE represented a major shift in modern macroeconomic policy because central banks moved beyond simply just adjusting short-term interest rates. Traditionally, monetary policy followed a relatively straightforward mechanism. Lower rates increased investment raised aggregate demand, and output expanded. However, near zero interest rates weakened this process. Policymakers therefore expanded central bank balance sheets directly through asset purchases. The quantity theory relationship MV equal PY helps explain this logic. Increasing money supply should theoretically raise nominal output and prices. However, whether this mechanism works depends heavily on money circulation and expectations. This explains why central banks increasingly focus not only on money supply itself, but also on expectations and financial market conditions. Now to the question number 1. Compare and contrast the evolution of QE in the USA from QE 1 to QE 4 with Japan's trajectory from the original QE and comprehensive easing to QQE. What were the primary objectives, specific outcomes of each is faced in both countries? The evolution of QE in the United States occurred in several phases. QE 1 mainly focused on stabilizing financial markets after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The Federal Reserve purchased mortgage-backed securities and treasury bonds to restore confidence and supporting banking institutions. QE 2 shifted attention toward supporting economic recovery because unemployment remained high and inflation remained weak. QE 3 became more aggressive because purchases continued without a predetermined limit. Policymakers explicitly aimed to improve labor markets conditions. Finally, QE 4 during the COVID-19 represented the largest intervention in Federal Reserve history, primarily designed to prevent a complete freeze in credit markets. Overall, U.S. QE gradually evolved from crisis management toward broader macroeconomic stabilization. Japan's experience was more gradual but also much more persistent. The first formal QE program in 2001 aimed to escape liquidity trap conditions. However, because growth remained weak and the deflation continued, policymakers repeatedly expanded intervention. Comprehensive easing in 2010 broadened asset purchases to include riskier assets beyond government bonds. The largest shift occurred under the QQE. Beginning in 2013, policymakers aggressively expanded balance sheets while explicitly targeting 2% inflation. Unlike the United States, Japanese QE became a long-term framework rather than a temporary crisis response. Although both countries implemented large-scale assets purchases, outcomes differed considerably. The United States generally experienced stronger labor market recovery and moderate inflation improvements. Monetary transmission worked relatively effectively because labor markets and financial systems was more flexible. Japan, however, faced structural constraints. Aging demographics reduced consumption growth. Persistent deflation expectation discouraged spending, and weak domestic demand limited policy effectiveness. This comparison suggests that monetary policy effectiveness depends not only policy size, but also on structural economic conditions. Now to question 2, discuss the fundamental differences between conventional monetary policy and quantitative easing. In your answers, specify the different tools used by central banks. The fundamental differences between conventional monetary policy and quantitative easing lies in both their objectives and operating mechanisms. Conventional monetary policy mainly influences the economy through changes in short-term interest rates. Policymakers attempt to change the price of borrowing, which then affects investment and consumption decisions. Quantitative easing operates differently. Instead of focusing on only on interest rates, QE attempts to influence broader financial conditions by directly expanding central banks' balance sheets. Another important distinction is when these policies are used. Conventional policy is generally effective during normal economic periods, whereas QE is mainly implemented when the policy rates approach the zero lower bound and traditional tools become constrained. Therefore, conventional policy mainly changes the price of money, while QE primarily changes the quantity of liquidity and financial assets composition. The tools used under each framework also differ significantly. Under conventional monetary policy, central banks typically rely on open market operation, reserve requirements, discount rates, and policy rate adjustments. These two mainly affect short-term financial conditions. Quantitative easing expands beyond these traditional instruments. Central banks purchases large quantities of assets such as government bonds, mortgage-backed security, and in Japan's case, even ETFs and corporate assets. These purchases increase bank reserves and liquidity within financial markets. As reserves rise, financial institutions gain greater lending capacity, which policymaker hopes translate into stronger spending and investment. Therefore, QE uses direct balance sheet expansion to influence economic activity rather than relying solely on short-term rates. Now to question 3, define the liquidity traps and provide a graphical analysis. Example, using money market to illustrate this condition, explain why the presence of a liquidity trap necessitates the use of QE rather than conventional monetary policy. Under these conditions, people prefer holding cash rather than spending or investing. As a result, additional monetary expansion produces only limited economic effects. The money market relationship between real money supply and money demand explains this problem. When interest rates become extremely low, the usual relationship between money supply and the interest rate weakens substantially. This condition explains why traditional monetary policy often fail during severe downturns. This graph illustrates why monetary policy becomes ineffective near zero interest rates. Normally, increasing money supply shifts money supply rightward and lowers equilibrium interest rates. However, in the liquidity trap region, money demand becomes almost horizontal, and when money supply increases from MS1 to MS2, interest rate decline only marginally. Therefore, additional liquidity mainly remains inside financial institutions or private savings rather than generating new spending. This was particularly important in Japan and partially explained why near zero rates alone could not restore growth. Now to question 4, applying macroeconomic theory, analyze transmission channels through which QE is intended to stimulate U.S. economic growth and achieve Japan's 2% inflation target, including graphical analysis using the ADAS framework. Once conventional monetary policy become constrained, central banks turn toward quantitative easing to stimulate the economic activity indirectly. The process begins with large-scale assets purchases, including government bonds and other financial assets. These purchases increase bank reserves and inject additional liquidity into financial markets. As liquidity increases, long-term interest rates generally decline, reducing borrowing costs for households and firms, lowering borrowing costs, and encourage firms to increase investment spending, which we can represent through the investment relationship where investment rises and as interest rates fall. At the same time, higher asset prices improve household wealth and confidence, generating stronger consumption demand. According to the national income identity, stronger consumption and investment directly contribute to higher aggregate demand. Therefore, QE attempts to restore economic activity not only through liquidity creation, but also through multiple transmission channels operating simultaneously. This graph summarizes the final macroeconomic objective of quantitative easing. As consumption, the investment increase aggregate demand shifts right upward from 81 to 82. This movement increased equilibrium output from Y1 to Y2, while also raising the price levels from P1 to P2. In the short run, higher output supports employment and strengthened economic recovery. Rising price levels were especially important for Japan because policymakers explicitly targeted positive inflation. Expectation can also play an important role. According to the Fisher relationship, higher expected inflation lowers real interest rates, further creating stronger incentive for spending rather than saving. Therefore, QE influences economic activity through both financial market and expectations management. Although quantitative easing generated important benefits, its effectiveness remained debated. Supporters argue that QE prevented financial collapse by stabilizing banking systems and restoring market confidence. Lower borrowing costs also help support recovery and reduce financial stress. However, critics argue that QE disproportionately increased financial asset prices and contributed to wealth inequality. Another major concern involves declining money velocity. According to quantitative theory, increases in money supply should stimulate nominal economic activity. However, if velocity falls because households and firms prefer holding cash, monetary transmission becomes weaker. This limitation particularly visible in Japan, where persistent deflation expectation reduce spending incentives. In conclusion, quantitative easing emerged because conventional monetary policy became increasingly constrained near zero interest rates. The comparison between the United States and Japan demonstrates that similar policy can produce very different outcomes depending on economic structures and expectations. Our analysis also suggests that monetary expansion alone may not fully restore growth when structural problems persist. Therefore, the most effective policy approach often combine quantitative easing with fiscal policy, structural reforms, credible communication strategy. Ultimately, QE should be viewed not as a replacement for conventional policy, but as an additional tool designed for extraordinary economic conditions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, today I'm going to present Case 2 AI Boom and Taiwan's Economic Growth. In 2025, Taiwan emerged as the global epicenter of the AI revolution, driving an unprecedented macroeconomic surge, propelled by a near monopoly on advanced semiconductors and AI infrastructure. Taiwan's GDP growth exceeded 8% with quarterly peaks surpassing 8.01%. Consequently, Taiwan GDP per capita surpassed both South Korea and Japan for the first time in over 2 decades. This growth was fueled by a massive wave of capital investment from both international and domestic sources. Foreign inflows, tech giants like Nvidia, Google, and Amazon significantly expanded their local R&D and data center footprints. Simultaneously, global institutional investors poured billions into the Taiwan Stock Exchange, driving the TAIEX to record highs. For the domestic expansion, leading domestic firms, most notably TSMC, significantly accelerated their capital expenditures. To meet the insatiable global demand for AI chips, TSMC and its local supply chain invested heavily in advanced 2nm and CoWoS packaging facilities, representing a historic peak in domestic private investment. Furthermore, Taiwan's trade has shifted decisively toward North America. Export to the US reached record levels, with monthly AI-related chips exports doubling by mid-2025. This deepened the Silicon Shield as the US relies increasingly on Taiwan to power its AI software dominance. Finally, the boom extended to the general public, with over 5 million individual retail accounts benefiting from the soaring TAIEX. A powerful wealth effect emerged. Rising portfolio value significantly boosted consumer confidence, driving increased private consumption in luxury retail, automotive, and domestic services. Let's see question 1. Based on the background provided, how has the AI boom altered the specific components of Taiwan's GDP? Identify which variables show the most significant changes and explain the underlying reasons. The GDP is made up of 4 parts: consumption, investment, government spending, and net export. Based on this case, the AI boom mainly increased 3 components: investment, net exports, and consumption. Government spending is not the main focus here because the background does not mention any major increase in government policy or public spending. First, the most significant increase is in investment. Investment increased greatly because many companies expanded their operation in Taiwan. For example, foreign companies such as Nvidia, Google, and Amazon AWS invested in headquarters, research and development centers, and data centers. At the same time, domestic companies such especially TSMC increased capital expenditure on advanced semiconductor production, including 2nm technology and CoWoS packaging facilities. These activities all count as investment because firms are spending money on factories, technology, equipment, and infrastructure. Therefore, the AI boom caused a very strong increase in private investment. Second, net export or NX also increased greatly. Net export refers to export minus imports. In this case, Taiwan's export increased because global demand for AI-related chips became much stronger. The case mentioned that Taiwan's export to the United States reached record level, and AI-related chip export doubled by mid-2025. Since Taiwan is a major producer of advanced semiconductors, the AI boom increased foreign demand for Taiwan's products. As a result, export increased and net export also increased. Third, consumption or C also increased. This happened through the wealth effect. As the Taiwan stock market rose, many individual investors benefit from higher portfolio values. When people feel wealthier, they tend to spend more. So even though the AI boom started in the technology sector, it also spread to ordinary households through rising stock prices and higher consumer confidence. Finally, the government spending is not clearly changed in this case. The background does not mention a major government spending program, so we can say that G is not the main variable affected by the AI boom. Question 2. Use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to illustrate the impact of the AI boom on Taiwan's economy. Does this primarily represent a shift in AD, SRAS, or both? Show the resulting impact on real GDP and the price level inflation in the short run. In this model, the vertical axis is the price level and the horizontal axis is the real GDP. First, the AI boom shifts aggregate demand, or AD, to the right. Aggregate demand increases because investment increases, export increases, and consumption increases. As mentioned earlier, companies are investing heavily in Taiwan. Taiwan is exporting many AI chips, and households are spending more because of the wealth effect from the rising stock market. So in the first diagram, AD shift from AD1 to AD2. When only AD shift right, the economy moves from the first equilibrium E1 to the new equilibrium E2. As a result, real GDP increases from E1 to E2, and the price level increases from P1 to P2. This means that the AI boom creates stronger economic growth, but it can also create inflationary pressure because demand in the economy becomes stronger. However, the AI boom is not only on demand side shock, it also affects the supply side. These investments do not only increase spending, they also increase Taiwan's ability to produce more output. In other words, Taiwan's productive capacity increases. Therefore, short-run aggregate supply or SRAS also shifts to the right from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2. In the second diagram, both AD and SRAS shift right. The economic gain moves from E1 to E2. Real GDP increases clearly from Y1 to Y2, but the effect on the price level is different. Since SRAS also shift right, the increase in supply helps reduce inflationary pressure, so the price level may increase only slightly or remain relatively stable, compared with the situation where only AD increases. Therefore, the best answer is that the AI boom represents both an AD shift and an SRAS shift. AD increases because of higher investment, higher export, and higher consumption. SRAS increases because semiconductor firms expand productive capacity. So in the short run, Taiwan experienced a significant increase in real GDP, while inflationary pressure exists but is moderated by the increase in supply. Let's see question 3. Distinguish between foreign direct investment FDI and foreign portfolio investment FPI. Which examples from the text correspond to each term? Additionally, explain how these massive capital inflows affect the value of new Taiwan dollar. FDI means that foreign investors directly invest in real business operation in another country. This usually includes factories, offices, R&D centers, data centers, or other long-term business facilities. In this case, examples of FDI include NVIDIA investing in its NVIDIA Constellation headquarters, Google expanding local R&D, and Amazon AWS expanding data centers in Taiwan. These are FDI because they involve direct long-term investment in physical business operation in Taiwan. On the other hand, FPI means that foreign investors buy financial assets such as stock and bonds. They do not direct control business operations. In this case, examples of FPI include global institutional investors buying stock on the Taiwan Stock Exchange and foreign capital flowing into the TAIEX. These are FPI because investors are putting money into Taiwan's financial market, but they are not directly building factories or managing business operation. Now, how do these capital inflows affect the new Taiwan dollar? When foreign investors invest in Taiwan, they usually need to buy new Taiwan dollars first. For example, if a foreign company wants to build a data center in Taiwan, or if a foreign investor wants to buy a Taiwanese stock, they need Taiwan dollar to make those purchases. This increases the demand for the new Taiwan dollars. When demand for Taiwan dollar increases, the value of the new Taiwan dollar tends to appreciate. In other words, massive capital inflows usually cause the new Taiwan dollar to strengthen. However, the appreciation may be slowed down if the central bank intervenes. For example, the central bank may buy foreign currency and increase foreign reserves in order to prevent the Taiwan dollar from appreciating too quickly. So overall, FDI and FPI both bring capital into Taiwan, and these inflows increase demand for Taiwan dollar, causing upward pressure on the value of the new Taiwan dollars. Finally, question 4. How does a booming stock market translate into real physical economic growth? Explain the theoretical link between rising asset prices and the marginal propensity to consume, MPC. At first, the stock market may seem like something purely financial. Stock prices go up and down, but they are not the same as real production, real goods, or real services. However, a booming stock market can still affect the real economy through something called the wealth effect. When stock prices rises, households that own stocks feel richer. Even if they do not immediately sell their stock, they may feel more financially secure because the value of their asset has increased. Because of this, people become more willing to spend money. This means private consumption increases. In this case, in Taiwan, the background mentions that more than 5 million individual retail accounts benefit from the rising TAIEX. So this was not only affecting big companies or institutional investors. Many ordinary households also experience higher portfolio values. As a result, consumer confidence increased, and people were more willing to spend on things such as cars, luxury retail, travel, restaurants, and domestic services. Now, this is also related to the concept of marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. MPC means the proportion of additional income or wealth that people choose to spend instead of saving. So in this case, rising stock prices increase household wealth. If households have a positive MPC, they will spend part of this increased wealth. This leads to higher consumption in the economy. Then business earn more revenue. For example, car companies, luxury stores, restaurants, hotels, and services industry may all benefit from stronger consumer spending. When business receive more revenue, they may hire more workers, increase production, or invest more. So the process is stock prices rises, household wealth rises, consumption rises, business revenue rises, and real GDP increases. Therefore, the stock market boom becomes real physical economic growth through the wealth effect and the MPC mechanism. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Helios, and I'm in charge of case 3, which is the US-Iran war and the oil crisis. By the early 2026, the global economy was beginning to recover from the inflationary pressures from the early 2020s due to COVID. Just as optimism was returning, a new conflict erupted between the United States and Iran. This war immediately triggered what the International Energy Agency described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Unlike the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, which primarily disrupted European gas supplies and global grain exports, the US-Iran conflict struck directly at the world's most critical energy choke point, which is the Strait of Hormuz. As the closure of the narrow passageway created by the conflict, it sent shock waves across international markets, setting the stage for one of the most severe energy crises in modern history. The consequences were not limited to regional instability. It also spread globally, affecting oil prices, transportation costs, and daily lives of millions of people around the world. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage between Iran and Oman. It is one of the most critical choke points for world energy trade. Nearly 20% of the global oil and liquefied natural gas shipments pass through this choke point every day. When Iran closed the strait and launched attacks on nearby energy facilities, including major sites in Qatar, roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day were frozen out of the global market. The impact was immediately severe. For example, Brent crude oil, which had traded at around $70 per barrel before the conflict, it surged to $120 within weeks. In the US, gasoline price had climbed to an average of $4.05 per gallon by April 2026, which is a 30% jump. This sudden spike did not stem from rising demand but a supply shock. Production and transportation costs also soared worldwide. As we can see, the energy price rippled through every sector in economies in Japan, South Korea, and across Europe and other countries around the world. And these economies began to contract even while inflation reached 40 years high. The US-Iran war also transformed the regional confrontation into a global economic crisis, marking the beginning of a new era of stagflation and uncertainty. And here it is one of the screen cap of the trading broker website of me for trading stocks, and I screen cap it to show you guys to know that the oil price surge is real. As you can see in around February, it is around in below $76 per barrel, but as the war broke out, it actually rose until the place you can see it has spiked. As I circled with red, it is actually the highest spot of the oil price, which is around above $115. Sadly, I didn't trade and reap a profit, but at least I'm not taking the risk. So yeah. Okay, we will start to answer the questions. As for example here, question 1. Compare the energy market disruptions of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022 and the Iran-US war in 2026. And we can see why does the conflict in the Middle East specifically led to such a rapid and severe spike in global gasoline prices compared to other regional conflicts. Okay, here, during the Russia-Ukraine war, 40% of the natural gas supplied to Europe is from Russia. And in order to not completely cut off the oil supply from Russia, which will spike severe economic consequences, European countries didn't apply full sanctions, but they still apply sanctions, which actually restricted supplies to restricted gas supplies to Europe, which made the crude oil price hit $114 per barrel in mid 2022. And for the food disruption, um, as Ukraine and Russia, both countries are the top exporters of grains of the world. And the export crashed, wheat price went up 45%, which global grain shortage affect markets. As at that time, I'm actually on an exchange year in Egypt during high school, and I can also see the economic impact, which before the conflict broke out, 10 pieces of Egyptian bread cost around 10 Egyptian pounds. But when the war broke out, 10 Egyptian pounds of bread, they only give 5 of them. I mean the price. I mean the amount of bread decreased in half. This is how I can also spot the economic impact at that time. Okay, then we'll talk about the U.S.-Iran war in 2026. As the Strait of Hormuz closure, 27% of the global oil trade and 20% of the LNG exports was blocked. The volume loss is around 20 million per barrel per day, frozen out of the market. Price surge as Brent crude jumped from $71 to $100 within days, then later peaking into 119 per barrel. Gasoline impact, which the retail fuel price in the US spiked sharply, and the natural shock is immediate and global, and there are no spare capacity to offset the losses. Okay, and we will answer why the Middle East conflict causes a faster spike. Okay, we can always, when we look at the Middle East, we will see Middle East is the central hub to supply oil. For example, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, these are very oil-rich nations. However, for the universal input, oil underpins a transport, manufacturing, and logistics, which, as Iran has attacked the oil facilities in the Middle East and the blockade of Hormuz, both actually disrupted the oil supply, which in market psychology, there will be a panic as the oils cannot come out, which actually causes a shortage in the market, which actually amplify the price jumps. So, in comparison, the U.S.-Iran war is a global oil supply disruption. It is faster and sharper. And for Russia and Ukraine, the war mostly created a regional commodity shock. Okay. For question 2, I'm going to define the term stagflation. And based on the background information provided, I'm going to identify 2 specific macroeconomics that are occurring simultaneously, and why this condition is considered more difficult for a country to manage than standard recession. Okay, let's start. First, to define stagflation, stagflation means higher inflation and economic stagnation at the same time. For historic context, it was first widely recognized during the 1970 oil crisis, when OPEC decided to embargo, which caused oil price to quadruple, and global GDP growth slowed sharply. And the modern example is the 2026 Iran and US war, which created a similar supply shock. Okay. There are 2 economic evils, macroeconomic evils. First, high inflation. High inflation means oil and transport costs surged globally after 2026 as the conflict erupted. Consumer prices also rose 8 to 10% in OECD countries, and living costs reach 40 years high. And the second evil is the falling output and employment. As the cost of running a business increases, firms cut production due to higher costs. And in Japan, South Korea, and EU, the GDP contracted by 1 or 2%. As a result, households face rising prices and job losses simultaneously. And we will say why stagflation is harder to manage. It is due to some problems. For example, policy dilemma. As as the cutting of interest rates, it boosts demand but worsens inflation. In raising raising the rates will control inflation but deepens recession. This is the policy dilemma. And for the central bank trade-off, it must choose between price stability and employment. And unlike a normal recession, a recession equals low inflation, which is easier to stimulate growth, or a stagflation, which is high inflation and low growth and no easy fix. Okay, and question 3. I will use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to illustrate the impacts of the US-Iran war on the global economy and show the shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, and labeling the results changes in global GDP and price level. Sorry. First, we will talk about the ADAS model before the war, the equilibrium. The initial state global economy is near the long-run equilibrium, as the aggregate demand intersects the SRAS, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. The output is the real GDP at a potential level, and the price level is stable. Inflation is moderating after the 2020s pressures, and employment is near the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, for the impacts of the US-Iran war, we can see the short-run aggregate supply, the curve shift as the oil price surged from $70 to 120. The transportation and oil production costs increased, and for the short-run aggregate supply curve, it shifts left as high input costs reduce aggregate supply in the short run. As a result, the real GDP decreases and price level increase. Okay, stagflation illustrated as a new equilibrium. There will be lower GDP as which lead to recessionary pressure, higher price level, which lead to inflationary pressure, which both macro evils occurs simultaneously. And there's a policy dilemma also. If the maybe government choose a stimulus, it will worsen the inflation. But if it tightens, it will worsen the recession. Okay, question 4. We will use the Philip curve framework and explain why it is impossible for the central bank to restore the economy to its original levels of inflation and employment, simultaneously using only standard monetary policy. What trade-off must the government accept? Okay, the Phillips curve and policy limits. As we see, the Phillips curve shows the inverse short-run relationship between inflation and unemployment. When one falls, the other tends to rise. The central bank goal is to restore both low inflation and low unemployment after the US-Iran